you know how you hate somebody a lot and then you hear something about them and you're like, that's actually pretty cool.
Sure.
That the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, she has like a drink with every meal. Like something like 4 drinks a day. Like she'll have like a gin and tonic in the afternoon, or like a glass of champagne with dinner.
Sure.
And like a glass of wine with lunch or something like that. I'm like, it's actually pretty respectable for an old lady like that. That's pretty cool. Like, when you start to lose mobility and shit,
Right, yeah.
By the way, I don't remember, I think we talked about this on the show before, but I think, Shane, you mentioned it about mush mouth.
Oh, yeah.
And losing like mobility and stuff. Joe Biden's new ad, when you listen to it, first off, the ad sucks. It says nothing. It's telling you nothing. It's not telling you how we're going to get out of it. It's just platitudes about we need to unite as Americans. But in the first like 10 seconds, he says something where I was just like, that didn't sound healthy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, everything he says through slurs.
Yeah.
I haven't seen his new ad. I don't know. I'm just like, I've tuned him out completely. I'm just want to forget that he fucking exists and that and that he's the candidate. You know what I'm saying?
I didn't want to dwell on this because, I mean, we didn't even talk about this, but one thing I really was interested in was talking about some of the populism stuff, if, Shane, you were still interested in it. But
yeah.
I am vibrating with anger every day with how the Democratic Party is willfully ignoring the credible sexual assault allegations against Biden.
Yeah, I know. That's what I see on Twitter when I do log on is like all of the Believe Women contingent of the Democratic Party just completely, employing the same excuses that they criticize Brett Kavanaugh defenders for using.
Right. Or Trump defenders, I mean,
it's pretty,
exactly.
it's pretty despicable. It's pretty incredible.
And I didn't independently verify this, but there was a tweet that had gone viral this morning with a screenshot of the old archive Larry King episodes from the 90s that CNN hosts on their website, and they deleted the episode where Tara Reade's mother called in.
Oh, no way, really?
Fucking hell, dude. I mean, I hope that creates some sort of Streisand effect, which, if anybody's not familiar, the Streisand effect was like Barbra Streisand had this incredible Malibu mansion or something like that on a cliffside, and there were pictures that were taken of a helicopter of this what would otherwise be private and not be able to be seen from the roadhouse, and so she made a stink about it, how she wanted those images taken out of the press. I think it was in like the 90s or something like that. And due to her bringing attention to it, the Streisand effect is like, the more you want something not seen in the public eye, the more the public eye is actually going to see it.
Right. Particularly like with the internet, like the idea that you could scrub something from the internet, you're just going to draw more attention to it.
Yeah. Joyanne Reed's homophobic comments.
Right.
That was a good example of it.
Yeah, but nobody cared about that. They're not going to care about. They're not going to care about this. I mean, I've seen takes regarding this that are literally like, I wouldn't care if he raped 100 women. We got to get rid of Donald Trump.
Did you see that, dude?
Yeah. It's incredible.
It really is incredible. It's like really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of them, they've, whether they're defending it or not, or whether they're trying to pretend like it didn't happen or not, I think a lot of them have accepted that it is true, and that they don't care.
I'm thinking about like young people and the Zoomers and whatnot, and I don't even know what the generation below the Zoomers is going to be called.
They're not even going to have a name.
War boys.
Yeah. They're gonna be fucking cannon fodder or something, or they're just gonna be scalp the rich on the streets or something like that.
Yeah.
Allegedly, it doesn't matter. Whatever.
But fine. It's fine. It's always fun.
But like this, I mean, it's just amazing how the electoral choice, but in November, is rapist A or rapist B, both of which who are nearly ideologically comparable. Yeah, Joe Biden will probably nominate some psychotic Republican to the Supreme Court if he were to be in office. And like I've said before, Trump is probably going to nominate Cobra Commander for fucking Supreme Court. But
Red Skull, folks. He's made a lot of good decisions. He's made a lot of good calls. Let's get him on there. He'll defend the sanctity of life and the Tesseract.
Folks, a lot of people said that Shredder didn't have any knowledge of law. He never served on the bench. But let me tell you what he did with the foot soldiers was remarkable. Probably he's going to be the best. In fact, probably we're going to have even Super Shredder even. So I don't know how this is the same Democratic Party that came down on Kirsten Gillibrand for saying that Franken's got to go. I mean, I think what we've learned is like any one of these personalities in the parties, like they're interchangeable. Like Al Franken was not worth keeping. Like what's so fucking remarkable about Al Franken that we need to keep him as a senator from Minnesota? Like who?
Some of them still are bitter about that. They want him back. Lawrence Tribe is one of those. Lawrence Tribe is like a big fucking like the Resistance or whatever Democratic account on there. He's still bitter about that. I think it's Lawrence Tribe. It might be Richard Painter. It might be both of them. It's probably both. Who fucking knows? They're interchangeable too.
Richard Painter. This is real inside baseball, but Richard Painter is the guy that looks like the lawyer at the end of American Psycho.
I don't know.
We'll look it up.
Okay.
But yeah, I just like now as we drift farther away from kind of the piece of the pie of political change that we're pushing for, the piece of the pie that represents electoral politics is getting smaller and smaller. Like it's just not going to be the avenue for change that we're going to have to focus on at this time. However, I will say I will fucking defend AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib in descending order too. I think Rashida Tlaib's like my favorite, with maybe a close second of Ilhan Omar. But like, we just got to keep those guys funded at the least, because they're going to have some psycho conservative, Democrat trying to primary them.
Oh yeah, dude. Oh yeah. That'll be a fun primary battle.
Good morning. Good morning.
Do you want to like do the show intro, or should I just start talking, or what?
Oh, yeah, we're fine. Just go into it.
It's been, I think, for Patreon, for the listeners, this is a bit more of an intimate conversation. We don't need to stand on airs. Everybody knows what the deal is. You're paying $5 a month. We're not gonna waste your fucking time with an intro. Yeah, let me do it right now. Don't. Ever since I was don't. Hey everybody, eat the rich. Shane, howdy, fucking Chris. Okay, this is something we wanted to talk about for a while. Populism. Shane happens to be a scholar. Let's learn about it. Shane, that's the intro. Please go ahead.
Webster's Dictionary of Words defines populism as it was something that I thought might be interesting to kind of talk about on the show, because it's a term that is very loaded. It's a very like nebulous term, right? Like populism obviously has been in the general public discourse for a while, but it has had a lot of focus over the last, 5 or 6 years, particularly after the surprise, and I'm doing that with a bunch of bunny ear quotes, the surprise shock election or whatever of Trump, and, the other kind of comparable movements around the world, Brexit, the rise of like figures like Bolsonaro, Erdogan, right? Like, other figures across the world that all seem to be part of this upswing in a certain kind of right-wing populism. And I think that's part of the reason why, I started kind of looking into the term and discovered it's like bizarrely contentious, like depending on where you go into. And so, I never really had a strong background in academia before I started kind of doing this stuff. And one of the weird things that strikes you when you start reading that literature, entering that world, is like the kind of weird definitional investment people put in certain terms, right? And part of that is obviously like a career thing, right? Like somebody stakes their career, their scholarly career, their book career, their speaking career, their teaching career on a certain model of how things work, or the claimancy of like the definition of a term. And then in addition to that, there's obviously like often underspoken, and this is what I think is more interesting, and this is sort of the little piece that I've been working on that I had sent you guys. There's like obvious ideological preferences and like beliefs that go into work that's done in political science and political communication. And there's also this weird attempt to pretend that those things are not there, right? Like there's this weird attempt in a lot of social science, and probably, I guess, science across the board, but there's this attempt to be like, oh, we're objective, neutrally looking at things, right? Which maybe has some currency in the natural sciences, but even still, there's a sort of open debate about, what that means. And I mean, I think like, this is probably self-evident to a lot of our listeners and to us, but, like, you know, when you kind of identify with a particular brand of politics, like we call ourselves leftists, we call ourselves socialists, communists, progressives, whatever kind of flavor of that you adopt, you start to know that, like, oh, I'm ideological. I have an ideological point of view. And then you can observe that, like, oh, other people in the world are ideological. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But for the, like, construction of the contemporary, like, neoliberal order, ideology is treated as if it's a bad thing, right? It's like, it's a pejorative thing, right? I mean, you can see this again in the way that, like, you know, with the Democratic Party trying to squash, like, the ideological wing of the party. Like, that was, I saw so many, like, stupid media things in the midst of the presidential primary, where it was like, you know, Bernie represents the ideological wing of the party, and, you know, other people like, what's the other wing? It's a political party. It has an ideology, right? Like, why should you shrink from that, right?
Especially when the idea, which is incredibly insulting, especially when the ideology is like, please stop killing us.
Yeah, right, exactly. And again, you know, the ridiculousness of this that I think is very apparent, you know, if you're on the left, is that, like, the people who are claiming to have no ideology clearly do have an ideology, right? Like, they have some kind of constructed view of the world, they have preferences, they have goals, they have ideas. So anyway, so where this comes around into populism stuff is, like, after spending a couple of years reading a lot of this material, and again, I have to stress there's been a huge glut of it post-Trump, because, and I think that's in part stirred by the general, like, hey, Trump sells books, or in the same way that Trump, you know, sells ads on fucking cable news, but also, you know, the sort of surprise thing, and it's, I'm not totally saying this is a bad thing, right? Like, I think he does represent a dangerous something, right? And so there is value in kind of examining it. So there's been a glut since he came to power, but also kind of just before then, about three kind of terms that I've seen crop up in literature a lot, which are, like, populism, polarization is the other one, and then like misinformation and disinformation and, like, the fake news stuff, right? And a lot of this stuff often feeds into each other. And, like, the perspective that you have to take to find currency in a lot of this literature, and I'm not trying to paint too broad of a brush and say it's, like, all really bad or whatever. It's just, like, there are these obvious ideological preferences that are embedded in the framing of those things. So, like, polarization, for example. There's a lot of literature about polarization, its relationship to populism, right? And so it's like, what is polarization? And what it fundamentally comes down to is the idea that, like, people are moving farther apart ideologically, and so that's bad, right? Like, the assumption is, like, that's a bad thing. Like, if people can't come to an agreement, that means that's bad, because democracy is about creating compromise, and it's about meeting in the middle and shaking hands with one another and working across the aisle. And so a lot of it, especially in American poli-sci stuff, is about, like, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans have moved super far from each other. And so, like, there's a certain extent that, like, you can, like, okay, there's a construction of that argument. You can say, like, okay, this is happening, right? But the real question, you know, it's all about the framing, right? And so if you take that for granted, the framing there that's not being said, or sometimes it is explicitly being said, is that the Republicans have moved super far to the right and the Democrats have moved super far to the left. And that's, like, and obviously if you're a leftist, you're like, what? No. Like, the Democrats haven't moved at all. If anything, they've moved to the right, right? Like the polls in like the Nevada caucuses and shit that were like, Bernie Sanders supporters are very liberal. Right, exactly. Yeah, it's also a construction of politics that assumes that, like, there's, like, a line, that ideology is a line, and on the left-hand side is very liberal, and on the right-hand side is very conservative, which is just, like, you know, nonsense, pablum, whatever. I mean, you know, this is, like, an attempt to quantify belief structures and then give you a score. There are all these kinds of tests, I'm sure people have seen them, where you can take them and it'll be like, you scored 0.6, and you could be like, that's my ideology, I'm a 0.6 Democrat. Like, whatever the fuck that means. It's like this meaningless kind of stuff to construct to try and figure out all these mechanisms of, like, why this is happening or whatever. But again, beyond the lunacy in my mind that, like, the Democrats have gone crazy far left, is in addition to that, there's this assumption that, like, the good thing is when the parties are indistinguishable from each other. Like, which...
Unreal.
Which would be, like, why is that good? Like, who says that's good? Like, that's... Like, I'm not saying that you can't make that argument, but then you have to make that argument. If that's what you believe, you have to make an argument for why you think that's the case. And of course, the unspoken reason for that argument to be the case, if you are like a political science or whatever scientist who believes this shit, the reason I would say is like, well, because the closer they are together, the more coordinated they can be in serving the interests of the ruling class. Like, that would be the reason why they come and meet in the middle, right?
Exactly.
And so if that's your theory of how politics works or how it should work or whatever, then that would make sense. So anyway, the reason why I'm kind of taking this tangent to talk about this polarization stuff is, the last couple months I've done a lot of reading about, like, populism. Again, there's been a lot of books out, there's a lot of journal articles in various academic circles, and in my view, a lot of it takes this similar position where there's this assumption that, like, there's this centrist vision of how, like, a liberal democracy should work. And populists are bad and dangerous because they don't want to compromise. And that's like the central framing that is put forward in a lot of this. And, depending on who you're talking about, you could, you might find yourself agreeing with that statement, right? Like, I would say, yeah, the problem with, like, the fascists is that they don't want to compromise and they have a very, like, polarized view of politics. Like, these, again, these terms could work in favor or in service of, a more ideologically astute kind of mechanism for this. But in practice, they don't. And that's when also, the problem that I found in terms of the use of populist as, like, an academic rhetorical term is that it also, similarly to the polarization stuff, it diffuses and obfuscates what the actual political problem is, which is very specifically in the last decade, there has been an upsurge in right-wing, xenophobic, hyper-nationalist, crypto-fascistic political movements across the world. Like, we know that that's the case, but then when you say it's populism, that opens up the door to then turn around and say, well, Bernie Sanders is also a populist, or, Jeremy Corbyn, he's a populist, and to draw these equations between the left and right, I mean, it's just a roundabout way of doing the horseshoe theory bullshit. Mm-hmm. It's a roundabout way of saying, like, Trump and Bernie are cut from the same cloth or whatever, because both of them are angry, or like what the fuck is the argument, right? And so that was the frustration thing that led me to kind of looking into what populism actually means and how it's defined. And in my kind of reading of a lot of this literature, it's a very nebulous term. It's an incredibly undefined thing, right? And it means something different depending on where you're reading it or who's saying it. And again, what are you trying to capture and what are you trying to say by it? And again, there's like a ton of books that have the titles of things like "What is populism?" or "Populism, a definition," like and all these kinds of things. And, having read a bunch of them, I don't, the conclusions that they come to are always framed from this perspective of, like, essentially good democracy is in the center and anything that's outside of it, therefore, is populist, which also is bad. And not only do, I find myself kind of ideologically disagreeing with this assumption that, if populism is inherently a negative thing or whatever, but it's also non-specific, right? Like, if you can call Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, fucking Jair Bolsonaro, and Hugo Chavez all populists, then what the fuck is the point of the term? It's a way to basically just say anybody that I don't like, right? And so then just from an intellectual point of view, that's infuriating, because that's the word doesn't mean anything. It has no meaning. It has no currency, right? And so I don't know, that was the place that I found myself in trying to examine, how to maybe more effectively use that word or define it.
So I just do want to say, I don't even know how to describe this. I think we all feel the frustration of having the kind of ruling class corporate media talk about progressives in such a anti-intellectual way, and just saying like, oh, these people are far to the left and therefore their ideas are invalid because they are fanatics. And they talk about leftism the same way that they would talk about like radical terrorism or something. Right. It's just like there's something inherently wrong with them. They don't know enough to know what we know, which is that you have to come into the center and shake hands with the people that want you dead. Like, so please keep going, Shane.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a question of like diagnosing the problem, right? And this is a thing that I found, at least in the academic space that I've been working in, is something that people weirdly are not willing to really do. Because the whole idea, especially if you're trying to take this objectivist view of like, you know, we're social scientists, we're political scientists, we're going to figure out problems, we're going to model what problems are, and then we're going to come up with solutions, right? This sort of like goal-oriented, policy-oriented material, right? Then you have to be able to diagnose what the problem is. And so that's why I take issue with the definitional thing, because without a definition, you can't say what specifically is the problem here? Like what is the issue? And in my view, right, it's that like fascism is on the rise again. And that's like a clear, specific political problem, right? Now, obviously, fascism as a term is also loaded. It's very nebulous. You know, I myself have been, guilty of like waiting too long on a line and calling it fascist or whatever. And obviously it's a term that gets like thrown around a lot, and it can also essentially become an equation of like the people I don't like or fascist, right? But like that doesn't mean that there isn't a meaning to fascism and there aren't like good constructions and definitions of fascism, right? And so again, in terms of sometimes diagnosing the problem and thinking about like why is a term like populism so popular, is because it sidesteps that ideological commitment that you have to make to just come out and say this is a right-wing thing that's happening. It's not a left-wing thing that's happening. Right. Like, it's a right-wing danger to, like, even from the perspective of like liberal democracy, right? Even if you're a centrist liberal, you have to be able to identify and say the thing that is like gonna target and possibly destroy the liberal notion of democracy is this new rise of like right-wing populist authoritarianism, right? And it's very located in that. And so again, like there have been so many books and articles I've read that like, again, throw out, they'll be like, you have Donald Trump on the right and you have Bernie Sanders on the left and they both represent the same blah, blah, blah. And there's like some general, idea that maybe you could get out of that where it's like they're both responding to a general anger moment, right? Like a moment of, mass anger. But they're obviously articulating it in very different ways. Mm-hmm. Their constituencies don't really overlap as much as people would like to imagine they do. And the thing is, ultimately at the end of the day, a guy like Bernie Sanders is fundamentally, in like a meta-political sense, a liberal in the sense that he believes in like the democratic state. He believes that there should be like a liberal democracy that holds things together. Whereas like a guy like Donald Trump clearly doesn't give a shit. You think anybody like that's like really on their side like cares about democracy or any of the rules or no compromise? They just want to win. And so even from the perspective, yeah, which is not incorrect, because the liberals think that, politics is about getting the right things done in the right way. And the conservatives know much more politically astutely than that politics is about consolidating power. Right, exactly. And seizing power. Exactly. So again, the weird irony, right, is that, and this is like the kind of line of thought that I've come to, is that like the whole idea of the social democratic project that like Bernie represented or, Corbyn represented, or, the progressive wing of people trying to enter the Democratic Party represent, like the reforms that they want to implement are the only thing that could actually probably save the liberal democratic state at this moment in history. And the fucking actual like hardcore centrist liberals hate them and would rather hand the keys over to the fucking people who have no interest in maintaining the democratic state whatsoever. Or alternatively, they diagnose both of them as being a problem. Like Donald Trump's a problem, but Bernie Sanders is also a problem. And it's like not like, again, if you actually think up through the ideas that you're articulating, right? One is clearly a danger to democracy, and one is a danger to like the pocketbooks of fucking CEOs. That's it. So
unbelievable.
So I mean, that's, again, these are things that are probably to a certain extent self-evident to people who already are on our side politically, but like, again, to get to the whole confusion or to deliberate obfuscation, I would say, of calling things like populist as opposed to fascist. There's also a thing within, academia, but I would also say within like journalism, within the media writ large, which is just this desire to appear objective, right? And so there's different motivations. Like I said, in the academic world, there's this kind of weird assumption that we have to maintain a scientific perspective. And I'm not saying, this is, by the way, not like everybody in academia. This is just like people who have, the connections to those kinds of like liberal think tanks and things, and the people who are actually closer to the levers of power. This is what they sort of believe, right? We have to maintain objectivity. And then, like, because of that, nobody wants to fucking call, a spade vis-a-vis like fascism, right? Like, nobody wants to use that term because it's so inflammatory, and they're like, well, that's not a productive discussion to have. And it's like, they're fucking rounding up people and putting them in camps. Like, what else? Like, what metric do they have to reach, right? And of course, on the, the right-wing side of this is this constant sidestepping and bullshit of like, well, actually, the fascists wore black shirts, so unless they're wearing black shirts, unless they have the fucking German Stahlhelm and they're doing the fucking Roman salute under a swastika, then they're not fascists, which is just like totally unproductive and stupid, right? Because that's a very surface way of looking at politics. That's tantamount to like, saying like, oh, the Nazis have socialists in the name, so therefore they're socialists. It's just like this meaningless fucking noise that's generated by this side in order to obfuscate what's actually going on, where there is a legitimate like threat to all of the things that these people purport to love, which are like democratic norms, democratic institutions, like civic life, like all of these things are being assaulted from a very particular direction. And unless you identify that and point that out as an enemy, then you're lost, right? Because then you get mired in all this stupid bullshit again of making these false equivalencies, and it's just a totally like it's a weird cycle of argument. And again, this is probably something that isn't maybe new to a lot of our listeners, so I apologize if this is like the kind of stuff you already hear or you're already thinking about. It's just very frustrating to be in an environment for me where there's just this like imminent resistance to just like fucking identifying as having an ideology within like when I write stuff, I write things with my ideological predilections like up front. Like I don't hide them because I don't have to, because I have some sense internally of like, I know what I believe, so it makes sense to present, it's intellectually honest to present your beliefs and be like, this is what I believe and this is what I think the problems are. And this idea that you can maintain objectivity or like stand outside of this world while like talking about it, to me is like, it's just patently ridiculous. And then the few times that I have seen people like actually own up to what their belief structures are, it's usually in this field, it's like a lot of people who will make claims about like, okay, I'm a liberal Democrat, like a small d Democrat, like I believe in the liberal constitutional framework of the state or whatever. And, and then like their diagnosis sucks because and it's obvious because their ideology is like bunkum, it's not productive, because then it's at the end of the day, I think outside of the academic circles, because a lot of this can seem like navel-gazing bullshit, and maybe some of it is, but like, these are terms that do have political currency in like popular press. I mean, again, everybody, you read articles all the time about the populist upsurge, people are always using it in their own discourse or identifying as populist, right? And again, populism, to me, ultimately, I think the problem with it is that it's a it doesn't represent an ideological point of view. Populism is more of like a feeling, and this was the kind of thing that the little piece that I had been working on that I sent you guys, populism is like a feeling more than it is a set of policies. It's a kind of aesthetic that you can dress up your rhetoric in. There's no like strategy of populist governance. And that's why I think it's not useful as a like political category. It's interesting as like a political communications category because you can say somebody's making a populist speech or somebody's using populist rhetoric or the way they frame issues is in a populist way. And that can be useful to make certain distinctions. I mean, certainly like we use populist rhetoric and we talk in a populist way, right?
Absolutely.
But when you identify it then as an aesthetic, you show that it's sort of meaningless to then be like, well, you know, you guys say things like we talk in a populist way and so does the president. Therefore, we must be Donald Trump. Like it's like a moronic equation to make because the other side of it too is that like you can use populist rhetoric without having any intention to do anything that's populist, right? Like in any meaningful sense, like which is to a large extent what has happened with like Donald Trump and the fucking the Trump turn in the GOP, right? Which is to like make these general populist kind of claims and statements about we're gonna, you know, come together, this like kind of new idea of nationalism. And in reality, the only thing that it does is like reinforce xenophobic policies and still like maintain the power of the rich, right? And so this, to go back to the fascism thing and vis-a-vis that classic stupid argument about like, oh, Nazis had socialism in the word.
Yeah.
Like the original fascist movements also did this. They used populist rhetoric to create a mass movement and to get support from the masses, but ultimately when in power, the few fascist governments that really did come in power were all about maintaining and reaffirming the existing like class hierarchies of the society. The only thing that they did, you know, they would sometimes have like vague social programs and things like that. But the point here being is that like they deliberately co-opted socialist rhetoric because they saw that the socialist movement was strong and had like a huge mass base, much more than it even does now, although, you know, it's starting to come back up in like democratic societies.
For the record, if anybody is trying to equate Nazis with socialists, they killed socialists.
Right, they fought each other in the streets like constantly. And yeah, and the first thing they did, right, when they came into power, was, you know, to ban all the fucking labor unions, destroy the Communist Party and the other socialist parties and stuff. I mean, it's interesting. There's one of the books that I've been reading that I really like called The Anatomy of Fascism by this guy Robert Paxton. It's a really interesting historical kind of view and looking at fascism and an attempt to redefine it and understand that, like, you know, fascism, even though we obviously the first thing we think of are like Nazis and, you know, maybe Mussolini, right? Like there was pretty much in every country in the world like a fascist movement in the 1920s. Only just some of them became successful. And so if you're really going to define it as like a movement and understand like what the connections are, you have to look at all of those movements, even the ones that didn't become successful, right? And to sort of diagnose them. And so one of the things that he notes is that the fascist rhetoric always, and the fascist like worldview always saw as its greatest enemy socialism and communism, and specifically like Bolshevism, right? Like the nascent USSR in the 1920s. And they, even though they hated liberal democracy as well, they always, the way that they framed it was like what they hated about liberal democracy is that liberal democracy was enabling socialism. That's the way that they saw it. Like you're allowing a slow socialist communist creep to come in. And again, you can fucking see this exactly in the rhetoric today of like the GOP when they call fucking Joe Biden a socialist or a communist or whatever. You know, I mean, it's utterly ridiculous.
Utterly ridiculous.
The point here, you know, just to kind of try to wrap it up a little bit, is that there's this deliberate refusal to engage with fascism, and I think that's pretty dangerous. And there's a few reasons why. There's the one that I already talked about, which is the like pretense of objectivity and not wanting to offend sensibilities, right? Because if you call somebody a fascist, the first thing everybody thinks about is the Holocaust, and then it can get mired down in like the Godwin's argument thing where it's like, oh, you know, and then it gets into these stupid fucking performative things of like, how could you call this genocide or whatever? And this, it gets into this awful thing. And so it's like, you know, if you're writing a piece for the New York Times, it's like, well, I don't want to call, you know, Tom Cotton a Nazi because then it'll, you know, blah, blah, blah. It'll cause all these problems or whatever. So that's the first one. And then the second one, which is, I would say, maybe somewhat more understandable, is that fascism is kind of like a, you know, it's like it can be the boy who cried wolf, right? It can be like, oh, you know, especially on the left, like, and again, I take personal responsibility for the times I've done this, right? Like anything that's like right wing, you could be like, oh, that's fascist, or anything you don't like can become fascist, and it's like, you know, that's not necessarily always productive or helpful. And then sort of building off of that as well, there's a danger in misdiagnosing things, right? There's a danger in like sort of drawing a connection to something that's really horrible, because then if it doesn't end up being that horrible, it diminishes the use of the term. And that's kind of the place we're at now, right? Where like if you call something fascist, they'll be like, well, you know, people have been calling XYZ fascist for the longest time and we haven't had another Holocaust or something. And so that's like the point where it's like, is it productive? And so I don't know. I think that there's a way. There's a lot of really good definitions that exist out there. Obviously, fascism is its own contentious term. Like the one that I always go back to is Umberto Eco's Fascism, this little article that he wrote in the 90s for the New York Review of Books. It's fantastic. You can get it for free online. I definitely recommend reading it. It's a very concise and useful definition. And if you're working with that, you can see that like they're definitely, even if we're not going to call it specifically fascism, even if you want to be like, fascism was something that happened in the 20th century, and it's not productive to call something now the same thing, because obviously there's different material conditions, there's different cultural conditions, there's, you know, you can draw comparisons, but ultimately they're not exactly the same thing. And so it's like, okay, fine, but still it's a right-wing thing. Right? Like, we know which side it's coming from. It's dangerous and it's bad. And, you know, for all the stuff that I've talked about it being bad for, like, the fucking liberal democratic state, it's bad for human beings. Mm-hmm. Like, even if you don't care about the democratic liberal state, like, it's a militarized, genocidal, maniacal kind of fucking ideological rise that has some amount of popular support. And that's really dangerous. And obviously, I think ultimately the solution to it can be found in exploring like left-wing ideology. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I became a leftist, you know, because I started to notice and paranoidly draw these connections and be like, you know, ever since I was like 19, I've been saying like the fascists are gonna come back. And so like, you know, and everybody called me crazy. They said, oh, there goes crazy Shano. He calls everybody who doesn't like a Nazi. And, well, guess what, motherfucker? I was right, okay? So, like, maybe it's time to set aside this nonsense of, like, you know, like, oh, we have to return to these norms, or we have to be objective in things, and be like, I don't want to be objective when it comes to fascism, you know? Like, there were a couple of times when I would give, like, talks and conferences at different things where you know, because I was studying, like, online alt-right stuff, and I would talk about it. And this was, like, in the early days, 2016, 2017, where it was, like, coming on people's radars and stuff. And people, you know, would often ask in a fucking Q&A session afterwards, they'd be like, so what do we do about this? Like, how do we deal with this? And my, like, sort of snarky response is like, well, you know, the theorist that I think has the best idea of what to do with fascism was Marshall Zhukov, and he had a pretty good solution in 1945. You know,
do we need to look this up?
He was the Red Army general who conquered Nazi Germany.
Got it.
So like, you know, they're like, and that's the thing, you can't negotiate with these people. And I think that's in part too one of the reasons why it's ideologically very difficult for people who have this idea of compromise being center. They don't have an idea of like how to approach this or how to diagnose this. They don't understand it. They really don't understand, like, what to do with this group of people. And, like, you have to just politically beat them. Because if you don't, look, dude, the last time fascists came around, you had a huge fucking mega state that was able to conscript millions of fucking Russian boys as cannon fodder to go fucking throw at them to finally conquer them. We don't have that now. Like, we don't have 2 million Russian boys who can die in the Volga for our freedoms or whatever. So, like, we gotta beat it now before it gets worse.
We got the TikTok teens. It's a start. It's a start, is all I'm saying.
It's not, though.
When I start seeing, like, millions of Zoomers on TikTok saying, I served the Soviet Union with no dancing or any text, then maybe I'll be a little bit more optimistic about what our strategic thing would be. I mean, obviously I don't hope for that, and I don't wish that solution happens, but if you don't kind of diagnose it and figure out a way to do it, I mean, again, this is self-evident to us. We look at it and there's no like moral equivocation in us to just be like, yeah, obviously Donald Trump is like a fucking fascist. He's not a smart one. He's not like a particularly like interesting ideological person, but he is obviously like, I mean, I've had people who like, when I brought up like Charlottesville, and I've been like, Charlottesville was a very stark example of the kind of rise of like white supremacist Nazi movement in recent years, and people will be like, can we really call them Nazis? And it's like, they're flying swastikas. They're not even, there's no fucking like,
I know.
There's no veil. They're literally like Sig Heiling and saying like Jews will not replace us. Like, what more of a signal do you need? Like, obviously, like some of those are like fringe groups, and they're not the mass support of them is not always like that. But I remember reading a poll right after Charlottesville happened that was basically like, do you support the people at Charlottesville? Meaning like the fucking Nazi protesters. And, it was like a 5-point scale of like, very support, somewhat support, neutral, don't support, do whatever. And so it was something like 2% of respondents said they very much supported them. And then 8% of respondents said they somewhat supported them. So that's about 10% of people who saw the fucking Nazi shit at Charlottesville and said, yeah, I could get behind that. And if you're talking about that being a realistic sample size, and the population of the country is about 300 million. That's 30 million people who saw that and were like, yeah, okay, I'm okay with that. And that's a dangerous number. I mean, any amount is a dangerous number, but that's not good.
I have to invoke, I was thinking about what you were saying with Charlottesville, and the only solution, and I think we've talked about this on our show with Alley Valley, how I was studying the Jewish veterans of World War II and their anti-fascist organizing in England directly after World War II, like in the 40s, and fighting against George Mosley. But anyway, one of my favorite leftist punk bands from the UK is a band called Oi Polloi. And I might suggest this for the outro music, but one of my favorite songs of theirs is Bash the Fash.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And basically what they were talking about, like the post-70s austerity, Margaret Thatcher, just hellscape that was the UK, and the beginning of the kind of like neoliberal iron fist that was causing people to look for answers, and they were finding it in fucking right-wing grifters. And that's, again, this is the British National Party, which is a fascist party in the UK. And they were just like, and I think there's a clip in the song, it's like, how do you deal with them? And it's like, you physically remove them from the streets. You need to physically remove them from the streets. And again, I'll echo what we learned in the about the 43 group and the Jewish anti-fascist activism in the UK, is there is no compromising, and the police are there actively to protect the fascists. In any one of, we have to hear them out. We have to allow them to gather and protest. Often they are, yeah. And no, you don't. No Nazi should feel comfortable showing his face in public, period. There is no compromising with them. And as you're saying, Shane, I mean, the liberal consensus is that, well, we need to hear them out. We need to allow them to voice their opinion like everybody has the right for. And it's like, these motherfuckers want to take away your rights or kill you. There is no compromising with them.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering when you were talking about that poll, Shane, that question. Like, I wonder what the percentage was that had like a neutral opinion of it. Like, that would be, I would say probably some who said that they're okay with it, or probably many who said they were neutral. Probably was imagining they may not be an endorsement of it, but it is like a liberal sort of idea of like, well, freedom of speech. I may not like what they have to say, but they have the right to organize. This sort of like, which is an endorsement of it, really, at the end of the day.
Right, exactly, yeah. I mean, it's so weird that, like, I mean, the thing again that I've keep coming up across up against, I should say, just in my own field, and that is often incredibly frustrating, is just like this total unwillingness to accept like sort of research and work that like identifies that as a specific problem. And it's not everywhere. There are some good places that do accept that, but there seems to be this weird like, and to me it's not like, I can't believe that it's controversial, right? Like, I thought the whole idea of like the post-war liberal order, I thought there was like a general sense in popular political thought that like, yeah, that fascism thing was pretty bad. Like a lot of people died in that big war. Maybe that's something we should try to avoid in the future. Like, and now I think in part of the reason why, again, it's something that people refuse to engage with. And I've seen this not just in terms of like, the specific kind of academic and institutional thing, but I've also encountered this among like certain other people in my network. It's becoming less so, but I think like there is this effective thing about like seeing World War II footage on like TV or in a movie and being like, that was the past. Like that could never happen again. Like, and because it's like black and white too, there's this sense of like, oh, that was our barbarous past. But now we're much more sophisticated than people were then. Like that, such a thing would never happen again. And it's like, not only could it happen again,
yes,
but like now we have nuclear weapons. Like it's like a lot worse if it were to happen again now. And so I don't know. I think there's this weird. It's almost like a mental block, like a refusal to engage with the reckoning that like, because if you accept that this is the problem, that there's like a rise of like right-wing crypto-fascist, if not outright fascist shit in the world that has taken power in a number of places in like the big states, not in like fringe little, internationally relatively like irrelevant countries, even though that would still be awful, but like in the major world powers like that have like the military capability and the fucking logistical capability to carry out genocide or to carry out World War. Like if you accept that, then it suddenly becomes like, oh man,
that's right.
Now I gotta go to a bunch of meetings. Like I gotta do all this stuff. I'm probably gonna have to like read some books and stuff. And it becomes like this weird, like, I don't really want to think that it's that bad. In the same way that like, I was thinking about this in my like apartment block, the fire alarms suck. And so occasionally, especially in the building that's like right next to mine, the fire alarm will go off. And it happened yesterday and it started blaring and it went on for like 20 minutes. And this happened one time and like everybody evacuated the building. They got out. I don't even know if there was a fire. It was a separate building, but it looked fine. I mean, it ended up being relatively okay. Even I guess it was a localized fire or maybe it wasn't. But so then yesterday when it went off, I went out to look and see was something going on in the other building. Maybe they need help. I don't know. Just to go see what's happening. And nobody got out. Nobody left the building. And it was presumably like the alarm just broke or something, or it was broken, you know what I mean? And so, I was like, we were watching fucking Avengers in bed, me and Carrie, and I was like, I don't really want to go check if the alarm is going on. And I said, all right, fine. I had to put on my pants. I had to go, to the fucking hallway and check outside. And it's like a pain in the ass to do. And it can create a situation then where then the alarm goes off and everybody just sits in their house going, I don't want to deal with it right now. And like, like the stakes are too high.
And the other allegory, which I think fits in exactly into that mold, is climate change. Because people are, completely unwilling to... I guess I feel it right now. Just like completely unwilling to be like, oh, there's this enormous weight and we are just like hurtling towards our doom. But I don't know. Do I have to like go turn off the hot water heater? Like,
right, exactly. I mean, and this is not to like call people out for not doing anything or whatever. I don't think that's a particularly productive thing to do as well. It's just a it's a diagnosing of what's going on, and I think that in part suggests one reason why it's like something that people don't really want to wrap your heads around, Like, I remember once I was in like a theater class when I was like 12 in middle school, and we were doing like improv games or something, and in my improv game I made a joke about Stalin.
Shane.
And nobody knew who Stalin was, so then I explained, I was like, he was like a dictator of the Soviet Union in like the 1930s, and I remember the teacher looked at me and said, Shane, why do you always have to think about such awful things and bring up such awful things? And I would like to say to that teacher now, guess what, motherfucker? I was right the whole time, all right? I was right to waste my brain being paranoid and thinking about this shit from a young age. So the point of this conversation is that I'm right. That's the point that I was trying to get across. Yeah, that's the wrap up. So thanks for subscribing.
Oh man. I know. I was just thinking that. I was like, okay. So given this, so what do we do? How do we have to organize? Like, what do we? I mean, now is so weird because I was like, one of my feelings, one of my reactions to kind of like in 2016 and like early 2016 was like, all right, this shit's pretty bad. I got to do something, and I joined DSA, and that was like my way of dealing with it, and I was like, very, very, still am active, but intensely active in organizing with DSA for like 2 years or something, 2.5 years, and then now that we can't even meet in person, it's just truncated the amount of things that you can do to organize, unless you like put flyers underneath your neighbor's doors for to try to organize your building, which I can't express enough how important it is to try to make those conversations happen, especially now when people don't have the money to pay the fucking rent and everybody is exposed to the fact that landlords fucking suck. They don't do shit. They don't even pay for they provide no value anyway. But showing up in the streets to punch Nazis is a good start. I don't know. Again, I will refer you to the prescription that the Oi Polloi song Bash the Fash says, which hopefully we'll be able to hear.
So if you weren't worried about the quarantine enough,
yes. Here we are screaming about Nazis again.
In fact, I was reading a piece about how a number of the sort of online recruitment organizations for like white nationalist alt-right organizations are having a boon right now because so many people are trapped inside. So it's a lot easier to sort of get at certain people who are going to be more likely to be either out of work or out of school and just kind of sitting at home on their computer all day.
But the alternative, the leftist alternative, Shane, is that Nancy Pelosi might not be able to afford another $30,000 set of refrigerators.
Right, exactly. That's the very liberal.
That's why we're very
response.
liberal.
That's very
Fucking hell. Oh, God, I can't say enough bad things. And the Nancy Pelosi defenders that find their ways into my mentions every time I point out the fact that, she's much, much happier to have Trump for another 4 years than to have a Democratic president like Bernie for 4 years.
Speaking of Nancy Pelosi, did you see my really cringy tweet
what?
I did?
No.
Oh, it was really good. It was, okay, so like Nancy Pelosi voice, right?
Yes.
Imagine it, right? Okay, Schumer.
Oh.
Whatever you say.
No,
Schumer.
that was not cringe. That was not cringe. I loved it, and I had it in my fucking head, and I was singing it all night last night. Literally singing it all night last night. Okay, Schumer. Whatever you say, Schumer.
She's like dancing in front of her fridges,
In her $700 Hermes sweater. Fuck. God, I am just... She is the worst. She is the worst. Again, pointing out the fact that we are governed by a gerontocracy who wouldn't be all that bothered with a climate holocaust because they're going to be dead soon.
Right.
Anyway, there's this article that I wanted to go through really quickly, and it came out 2 days ago, and the headline was, "Stay cool, folks." It's not even a good joke.
Not particularly.
That's good.
It'll do.
Neo-Nazis take a seat on a London council. The extreme right-wing racist British National Party has scored its first political success in Britain. In a council by-election last night, it took the Millwall ward of Tower Hamlets in London's East End. The area has been the scene of a string of vicious race attacks. A week ago, 17-year-old Asian Qadis Ali was beaten senseless by a white gang and left for dead. He's still in a hospital with a coma.
What can anybody do about it?
Fight them, basically.
But how do you mean fight them?
We'd say that the ideas that they put forward outside football grounds, on working class estates, have to be combated politically, but also that they've got a physical agenda, and that has to be met physically as well. People have to defend themselves against the fascists. They can't just turn the other cheek.
and I did nothing to help them because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did nothing to help them because I was not a communist. Next they came for the trade unionists, and I did nothing to help them because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to help me. Adolf Hitler himself said that the only way the rise of the German Nazi Party could have been prevented was if its enemies had recognised it for what it was right at the start and had smashed it in its infancy with the utmost force. But once we'd agree with him, waving placards and chanting at fascists through megaphones accomplishes absolutely nothing. The only way to stop Nazi scum like the BNP is by physically confronting them and literally kicking them off our streets.